Chapter 3, Censorship. Censorship was an official policy of the U.S. government and its public health organizations overseeing the COVID response. They illegally enforced the censorship in collusion with private enterprise. This is not hyperbole. As we saw in the Amnesty International review on policing in the prior chapter, police in many countries are being used to physically arrest and intimidate people for publicly criticizing the pandemic response. However, the tactics used to silence dissent are much further reaching than this. Those tactics, which we will outline in this chapter, have come not just from the public sector, but also from an unholy union of public and private. And this criminal conspiracy, which in the United States is the most blatant possible violation of the First Amendment, has been openly and proudly stated on several occasions. In terms of actions, Alex, that we have taken or we're working to take, I should say from the federal government, we've increased misinformation research and tracking from within the Surgeon General's office. We're flagging problematic posts for Facebook that spread disinformation. My emphasis, we're working with doctors and medical professionals to connect medical experts who are popular with their audiences with accurate information and boost trusted content. My emphasis. So we're helping get trusted content out there. Biden regime Press Secretary Jen Psaki, July 20,211, providing for Facebook or other platforms to measure and publicly share the impact of misinformation on their platform and the audience it's reaching. Also with the public, with all of you, to create robust enforcement strategies which bridge their properties and provide transparency about rules. You shouldn't be banned from one platform and not others if you for providing misinformation out there. My emphasis. Jen Psaki, the next day I could provide quotes by more than just the press secretary. Too, this brazenness is not isolated to her. But we will get to similar examples as we go. For now, what she is flaunting is as illegal as it is immoral. It is an open confession of criminal corporate, governmental collusion. What she refuses to acknowledge when discussing this anti-science, illogical, un-American idea of misinformation, is that over the course of the pandemic the large majority of censored sources are the very doctors and medical professionals she refers to. In fact, the term misinformation itself seems to be a weapon in this psychological censorship war, just as much as the term conspiracy theorist was weaponized by the CIA to similarly justify dismissal/silencing of dissent. And the truth is that in many ways during the COVID era, it's worked. The following are just a few of thousands or, as we will find, millions of documented examples of esteemed doctors and medical professionals being censored by what we have now seen is a confession of an illegal government, corporate union to bury dissent, the Great Barrington Declaration, signed by 14,879 medical and public health scientists and 43,804 medical practitioners, as discussed previously, was censored by Google and Reddit. 3,4 famed epidemiologist and early opponent of lockdowns Martin Kulldorff was censored by Twitter and LinkedIn. 5,6 inventor of mRNA technology Robert Malone was censored by LinkedIn and YouTube. 7,8 America's frontline doctors, representing a coalition of 600+ medical professionals, was censored by Facebook. 9 The spirit of censorship carried into the medical profession as well, with Dr. Mary Talley Bowden having been suspended and forced to resign her hospital privileges at Houston Methodist Hospital over the hospital's slanderous opposition to her successfully treating more than 2,000 patients with ivermectin. 10. Dr. Meryl Ness had her license suspended and was ordered to undergo a psychiatric evaluation by the Maine Board of Licensure in Medicine for prescribing patients ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. 11. Dr. John Witcher, Mississippi physician since 1996, was allegedly threatened with license revocation over opposition to the COVID inoculations. 12. Dr. Andrew Kaufman was censored by YouTube. 13. YouTube also admits to having censored more than 1 million COVID Related videos 14. The dangers of censoring the very types of doctors and experts Psaki referred to seem obvious. Unfortunately, the regime she served admitted to aiding and abetting these censorship efforts despite those dangers. What has been clear to many as a result is that misinformation simply means information this regime disagrees with, especially since there is no shortage of experience/credentials amongst those who do disagree, my own included. In later chapters we will elaborate on the damage this has caused because of just how wrong they were. But so far we saw this already as it related to the lockdowns and the support of authoritative sources for those disastrous measures. Based on this alone, we can already see without question that the people pushing this notion of misinformation do not have anyone's best interest at heart. And even without analysis of any kind, this is apparent simply by their intentional prevention of people's access to all points of view, which would be necessary for a person to truly draw informed conclusions on matters of science especially. For example, one need only look at Anthony Fauci's monthly change of opinion on mask wearing or the Food and Drug Administration's past approval of Quaaludes. Among many other times these organizations changed a stance on something. 15,16 And it is okay to change stances on things if all you are doing is making recommendations. That, of course, is what science is. It changes all the time and any past conclusion can be disproven with any new observation. However, this is also what makes any particular scientific conclusion's enforcement or coercion immoral, but also illegal. And this is laid out in the Nuremberg Code, which those who engage in censorship are in violation of 17(1). The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This means that the person involved should have legal capacity to give consent, should be so situated as to be able to exercise free power of choice, without the intervention of any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, over-reaching, or other ulterior form of constraint or coercion, and should have sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the elements of the subject matter involved, as to enable him to make an understanding and enlightened decision. So, based on this passage, 2 questions: does censorship of dissenting opinions, which is what Psaki's quotes above confess engagement in, allow for a person's sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the elements of the subject matter involved? If there is suppression of dissent, alternate points of view, can a person possibly make an understanding and enlightened decision? The answer to both questions is a resounding no. The U.S. government and the companies whose actions it apparently dictates have violated the informed consent of the American people, in open abridgment of its own constitution. They were not alone, however. This took place all over the world. In the UK, for example, it got even worse, in the form of the 2021 Online Safety Bill. 18 described as the flagship legislation to combat abuse and hatred on the Internet. This law would create the concept of a knowingly false communication offense, which would criminalize those who send or post a message they know to be false with the intention to cause harm. The litany of problems with this criteria come from its intentional obscurity. For example, does it include sarcasm? How can anyone possibly prove an intention to cause harm from a limited online post that isn't a direct threat? They couldn't. And this brings us to the truth of the matter. Per Summit News, UK, government sources gave the example of anti-vaxxers as a target of the bill. Do anti-vaxxers know the information they post to be false? The majority obviously believe what they are posting to be true, like 99% of people with an opinion would be expected to. Also, who gets to decide what constitutes as false, as the bill outlines? Is it the same experts who endorsed lockdowns at the expense of the entire world's health and well-being? We will see throughout this book that these experts were wrong and/or lying the majority of the time. But the point remains, it is the opposite of science to suggest alternatives shouldn't be publicly hypothesized and tested. The hallmark scientific practice of peer review is essential for this very reason. So bills such as this are not drafted for science or public protection, but rather to control what is shared publicly to the narrowest possible selection of government-approved ideas. The Event 201 Pandemic Simulation Recommendation. In order to further understand how censorship became acceptable enough to openly declare it as a source of pride, we must dive into the premeditation to enforce it, specifically as it relates to a coronavirus outbreak. At this point it is well documented that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the World Economic Forum, WEF, and the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg School of Medicine held a global pandemic preparedness simulation in the fall of 2019, immediately before the pandemic was identified. This exercise was called Event 201. What is not as well known is the content of Event 201's recommendations, provided by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the WEF, for global public health organizations to follow in response to such a pandemic. 20 These recommendations came as live participants in the simulation described conspiracy theories that are around about the potential that pharmaceutical companies or the UN have released this virus for their own benefit. Another participant added that, maybe it's time for us to showcase some cases where we are able to bring forward some bad actors and leave it before the courts to decide whether they have actually spread some fake news. One would wonder, based on these real statements given by the actual people involved, whether the scenario was meant to simulate the North Korean government's response, given how illegal it would be in Western countries like the US to put someone before a court for fake news. Back to the recommendations though, while each of the 7 total recommendations can be thoroughly dissected, the most important one we will focus on here is recommendation number 7. It reads as follows: governments and the private sector should assign a greater priority to developing methods to combat misinformation and disinformation prior to the next pandemic response. Governments will need to partner with traditional and social media companies to research and develop nimble approaches to countering misinformation. This will require developing the ability to flood media with fast, accurate, and consistent information. Public health authorities should work with private employers and trusted community leaders such as faith leaders, to promulgate factual information to employees and citizens. My emphasis. Trusted, influential private sector employers should create the capacity to readily and reliably augment public messaging, manage rumors and misinformation, and amplify credible information to support emergency public communications. National public health agencies should work in close collaboration with the World Health Organization to create the capability to rapidly develop and release consistent health messages. For their part, media companies should commit to ensuring that authoritative messages are prioritized and that false messages are suppressed, including through the use of technology. My emphasis. It should go without saying that the opposite of authoritative is not false. Information can be both authoritative and false, as we've only just begun to demonstrate with Anthony Fauci. Yet, this recommendation by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation shows just how easy it is to pervert language in one's favor. As can be seen in the first bold section above, the foundation openly ignores both laws against public/private collusion and corruption, as well as the separation of church and state, and business. These ideas fly in the face of foundational Western principles and sovereignty in the name of a centralized, global power structure, as identified with the mention of World Health Organization, WHO, coordination. I cannot tell you how many times over the past year and a half I have been asked, but if there is global deceit behind this pandemic, then how is it all coordinated? The aforementioned recommendation answers this question better than anything I can possibly think of. And we don't even have to assume bad intent to get there. Let's just pretend, for now, that all these actions have just been a long series of tremendous mistakes. Would this degree of centralization of authority lend itself to more catastrophe for each erroneous decision made by such a global authority, or less? If the Netherlands prescribes the wrong treatment, for example, the world does not suffer the consequences of what the Netherlands previously deemed misinformation. If the WHO prescribes the wrong treatment, however, and the national public health agencies all work in close collaboration with it as the recommendation suggests, the entire world absolutely suffers the consequences of every mistake made by this handful of people. Later chapters will make painfully clear what those consequences have been. Relevant questions now appear: who are those handful of people responsible for the fate of the world's health, and who are ultimately, as seen above, controlling what can or can't be said or amplified in the public square? Who elected them? Who do they represent? Whose interests do they serve? What are the consequences of their failures? I will not answer any of these questions with speculation. My goal in this book is to make no claims whatsoever as to the intent of any of the actors in this story. What I am presenting is strictly means, motive, and opportunity, all of which are present in the case of Event 201 and should be, at minimum, understood by people and businesses who pay any mind to the opinions of these groups. Besides the simulation itself being well known at this point, it is also known that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is the largest funder of the WHO, contributing more to the organization's $4.84 billion biennial budget than any member state government. 21. I will not get into the documented cases of past corruption by these groups here, though there are several, as this book is focused specifically on decisions made related to the COVID era. For more on the WHO, though, one can watch the cited documentary, Trust WHO, produced by Lillian Frank, or the documentary, Who is Bill Gates, by James Corbett, for more on Gates' relationship with the WHO, the pharmaceutical industry, and even the media. 22. The nature of these conflicts of interest are certainly relevant to what is occurring today, so the background is valuable. Fact checking. The final issue we will address in this chapter is the brand new, completely dystopian concept of fact checking. The decade of the 2010s could be characterized accurately as involving a war for the internet. During this time period, terms like fake news rose to great prominence, as the onset of social media resulted in a mass congestion of information and clashing opinions. Polarization and confusion amplified over this time period to an extent which would have made ex-CIA Director William Casey proud. 23. But I digress. As confusion increased, so too did a demand for truth. However, the fact-checking blogs which resulted from this demand arguably made the problem significantly worse. A primary theme we have discussed in this chapter is the dangers of a centralization of information. As we saw with Event 201, such control is readily attainable through financial conflicts of interest. So when considering the biases of any media, we must consider those conflicts. And they aren't hard to reason out. Think of any commercial break you've ever seen on cable TV. How many of the advertisements are for pharmaceuticals, on average? If you're having a hard time remembering, here's a run down of CNN's Q1 2018 spend for some of their top 15 advertisers. 24. Top 15 advertisers total revenue, $25.86 million. Pharmaceutical companies in top 15, $7.61 million, 29.4% of total. A Tesla, Amgen, $2.52 million. Humira, AbbVie, $2.52 million. Xarelto, Janssen, $1.31 million. Harvoni, Gilead, $1.26 million. Now, consider you were an executive at a corporate media outlet like CNN. Would you risk nearly 30% of your organization's revenue stream and your job, at the expense of your shareholders, in order to break a story on those pharmaceutical companies and potentially sever ties. Maybe you think you would, but for most people this isn't the case. And this is just for ads. How about paid posts? The following is an actual paid Twitter post on behalf of Pfizer by CNBC, a network which also purports to have some degree of journalistic integrity. 25. After delivering the first COVID-19 vaccine, Pfizer is uniquely positioned to advance mRNA, which could be a breakthrough for other infectious diseases, genetic diseases, and cancer. cnb.cx/3a9txfn, paid post for @Pfizer, hashtag ad. And that's not all. Next there's sponsorships of the corporate news shows themselves. The following are some of the shows sponsored by Pfizer alone, possibly the most significant player in the manufacturing of the COVID shots. Good Morning America, CBS Health Watch, Anderson Cooper, 360 ABC News, Nightline, Making a Difference, CNN Tonight, Early Start, Aaron Burnett out front this week with George Stephanopoulos, Meet the Press, CBS This Morning, 60 Minutes. These same issues apply to an even greater degree as it relates to fact checkers, which are just the newest perception shifting instrument. An important question which arises from said instrument is, who will fact check the fact checkers? This question is answered in great detail by James Corbett in his investigative report of the same name. 26. To summarize some of James' findings: conflicts of interest. Reuters is part of the Thomson Reuters Corporation, which partners with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on the Generation Africa Program 2020 and the Thomson Reuters Foundation. Africa Check, another fact-checking site which frequently debunks claims about Gates, well documented by Corbett in Who is Bill Gates? Escapades in Africa, is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Open Society Foundation. The International Fact-Checking Network is also funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Open Society Foundation. Finally, Fact Checker NewsGuard was discovered to have been founded by prominent neo-conservative oligarchs such as Tom Ridge, Secretary of Homeland Security under George W. Bush, and retired General Michael Hayden, former CIA Director, NSA Director, and Principal at the Bush-Tide Chertoff Group. Fact checkers tend to fact check selective bits of strawman claims. An example provided by Corbett is fact checks on whether Event 201 predicted the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus pandemic, which is alleged to have broken out within weeks of the simulation event taking place. It is obviously irrelevant whether or not Event 201 discussed the specific pandemic pathogen, even if it did discuss a novel coronavirus. The timing of the Event 201 pandemic outbreak simulation coinciding exactly with what is believed to be a once-in-a-century pandemic outbreak is incredibly suspect, no matter what specific details were discussed. 2. Fact check specifics is intentionally misleading, pointless, and demonstrates a bias on the part of the fact checker. Fact checkers take actual, stated plans and debunk them. An example of this comes from Reuters, who fact checked an apparent claim that Bill Gates plans on using microchip implants to fight the coronavirus. Again, the intention to deflect and gaslight those who question an actual statement Bill Gates made about implants and certificates related to vaccines is clear. In the article itself, Reuters even admits as much, when it acknowledges both a detectable quantum dot vaccine patch technology Gates has supported, and a Reddit AMA where Gates said, "Eventually we will have some digital certificates to show who has recovered or been tested recently, or when we have a vaccine, who has received it." These discriminatory goals identified by Gates observers at the beginning of the pandemic are now clearly being implemented in real time, and Gates continues to profit from all of them. 27 Outright falsity and / or dishonesty in one of the most ironic of all fact checks. PolitiFact on January 31, 2020, said it is true that the likelihood of people in the United States catching the virus is minimal, while calling false claims about the virus's source, conspiracies about its connection to biological warfare, information about its spread, and misconceptions about how to treat it. 28 It is objectively impossible, based on the information available at the time, for PolitiFact to have known any of these things were true or false with any degree of certainty. Expert opinions were proven to not necessarily be facts or truth. In an April 3, 2020 Time magazine article, correction to previous article Opinions on Masks 29, a previous version of this article was based on expert guidance at the time of publication, but as the COVID-19 pandemic has grown in the U.S. in recent weeks, public health thinking has changed. What Time magazine is admitting here is that the facts, aka the opinion of sources who they deem credible and who others are entitled to the autonomous discernment of deciding if they feel the same, have changed. Articles concluding, mostly true, or half-true, facts, which defy all logic and understanding of what the truth is. 30 MSN published on January 1, 2021 that Bill Gates was trying to dim the sun, then fact-checked themselves 2 months later on March 3, 3132 Bill Adair, founder of PolitiFact, admitted the following about PolitiFact, Truth Rankings 33, yeah, we're human. We're making subjective, my emphasis, decisions. Lord knows the decision about a truth, meter rating is entirely subjective. Thus, affirming PolitiFact is a subjective, entertainment platform. Reuters presented disagreement between scientists as misinformation and sourced its fact checks with an endless loop of its own fact checks. 34 It also slandered the scientist in question in the article as anti-vax, despite exhaustive claims regularly made by the same scientist that he is pro-vaccine. Reuters fact checkers admitted they mischaracterized Pfizer/BioNTech, Moderna, and J&J inoculations as approved, when they were not approved, in an article about why they feel the inoculations are not experimental, an egregious error given the subject and the implications on mandates, to be discussed. 35 The Independent, November 4, 200 and 2136, fact check. Ron DeSantis falsely claims vaccinated citizens without boosters could be declared unvaccinated and lose their jobs. Countries like Israel had already taken up this practice months before. 37 And it took less than 2 weeks for Anthony Fauci to prove the independence, fact check, absurd in the case of the US as well. 38 When we look back on this, we're going to see that boosters are essential for an optimal vaccine regimen. Demonstrating time and time again these are biased political bodies incapable of determining fact. The Washington Post in August 2021 also went after popular authoritarian target, Ron DeSantis, claiming his description of COVID as seasonal was misleading, according to experts. 39 By January 2022, however, the Washington Post supported the previously misleading idea of seasonal COVID, without any mention of how the aforementioned experts were wrong. 40 These types of articles can be picked apart for days. The point of this chapter is not to do that, but to simply demonstrate how dissent is discredited in a lazy fashion by media lackeys, as opposed to taking place in a scientific debate amongst experts. By December 2021 this was even admitted to by Facebook itself, which reportedly defended itself in court by claiming the fact check labels it uses are protected opinion under the First Amendment. 41 This is a strange defense, considering the company also represents itself as an open platform and therefore not subject to liability as a publisher of said opinions. but we've already established that the government freely admits to working with Facebook to violate the free speech of dissenters, so it cannot be expected at this point to enforce the law at the company's expense. At the expense of respect for the intelligence of the people, these efforts shamelessly attempt to propagandize. The fact-checking continues. And the hilarious desperation of those involved was ever so evident in a January 2022 piece in Poynter, titled, "An Open Letter to YouTube CEO from the World's Fact-Checkers." 42 I personally cannot even fathom the level of narcissism necessary for people to brand themselves the world's fact-checkers. But this is what we live with today, a group of people who, if they were not knowingly and intentionally pushing an agenda, would simply be considered a bunch of self-aggrandizing sociopaths who become more of a laughingstock to the sane by the day. The thing of it is, however, that they are pushing an agenda. An analysis by Rahim Kassam on the organization behind this open letter revealed its member groups suffer from partisanship and transparency issues, with an undisclosed amount of funding coming from Google. 43 editors/contributors were also hard or impossible to find any background at all on, with one fact-check cited doctor having no relevant online footprint whatsoever. Still, the fact-checks published by these front groups are used by the social media companies in a type of information laundering effort to push otherwise reprehensible ideas. One such example which prompted Kassam's investigation was when he was fact-checked on an article he shared by Forbes, which in the spirit of censorship and dissent crushing discussed the idea of using psychoactive drugs to make people more likely to adhere to social norms such as wearing masks and adhering to social distancing guidelines. The fact-checkers simply referred to the Forbes article having been revised and claimed the Forbes author didn't actually support the mass drugging of the population. 44 However, this concept of mortality pills was nonetheless a real proposition posited by a so-called bioethicist. 45 Such things revealed the lengths to which COVID narrative supporters were willing to go to enforce their will during this time, which the fact-checkers' primary mission was clearly to cover for in any way possible. In summary, one would think we would want to hear from people who disagree. In order to make an informed decision, we would need to know why they have such a different opinion on a subject as important as what we put in our bodies. Science, of course, is simply a method of observation and experimentation, with conclusions drawn from said observation. So a time such as this would be the most important imaginable for a public debate on the methods and conclusions drawn. Instead, bloggers who receive funding from oligarchs slandered, as demonstrated, and spun dishonest narratives. These narratives were then used as a justification by officials for the exact purpose of preventing the full, scientific debate in favor of pushing an agenda. The result was actual, credentialed doctors having their opinions stifled by untouchable bureaucrats, and the cost, which we will tally in great detail in the next few chapters, of that stifling has and will continue to devastate human health well into the future.